Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Alice Fridlich. I'm a lecturer in urban development planning here at Manchester, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Tanzil Shafique from University of Sheffield, where he's a lecturer in urban design and associate at the Urban Institute. He'll be speaking with us today about his recent book called City of Desire. His previous publications include Off-Grid Toilets and Atlas of Informal Settlements. He brings a deep understanding of Southern urbanism and applied practice, and able to bring to life the stories and humanity of people in the Global South, including through convening a think tank on JustURBAN in Dhaka. So it is our absolute privilege and pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, of course, to be here and then to speak on the book which came out. I'll be using a lot of jokes in my presentation because right now you've seen how University of Sheffield is cutting jobs, and I'm practicing for a stand-up comedian, so excuse the informality of the talk, but I find it really interesting because the way that the book is written, you will see that informality is actually weaved in the way that it's described in the stories and the way that it's talked about. It's not an academic book per se, so that's straight off the bat. So that's the cover of the book. It's open access. You can get it online, but I'd like the libraries to buy it because it helps me with the publisher. There is a foreword in the book by Abdul Simon. Again, very lucky to have that. But where does this book begin? The book begins during what I did my undergrad in architecture in BRAC University in Bangladesh in Dhaka, and that's actually the headquarters of BRAC on this side, and which is right in the middle of the city. You have this large settlement called Korail, on which the book is. And for 5 years during my undergrad, I actually had to commute. I didn't have to, but I decided to commute through the settlement because of the traffic on the main roads. It was much better if I just actually went through the settlement, take a rickshaw. Now my dad wasn't too happy about it because he's like, this middle class fear of informal settlement is like drugs and criminals, and it's like I see pretty much like a rudimentary Venice in the making. It's like, okay, people, and bazaar, and people building the places. So I do that, and in architecture school we read about how to design beautiful towers. Architects often talk about, oh, we just need to get rid of this and we need proper housing. And what I see there does not resonate with what I read in sort of like this dogmatic texts that we get. And so the seed of the project is actually born there, that I'm interested in how this settlement grew, because I found a lot of descriptions, but I really didn't find how it was growing as an urban place. First things in terms of the book. Okay, this book is not the PhD dissertation. The PhD dissertation is dry, it's boring, it's sitting in a reserve at the University of Melbourne. You can download it and read it if you want. But this is the story of how this book came about. I come back from my PhD, the field work for a year, and then I actually write these 11 short stories, and I submit it, and it's not academic enough. And they actually give me 1 year, like 1 month to write one chapter academically. And quite literally, it was said, if you want it, you can publish it later. So I was like, okay, let me do that. That's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is the way the book is written with sort of like the premise that I'm interested in settlements which are growing beyond the state and beyond capital. And when I say capital, I mean large-scale, market-based institutions, real estate developers, and all of that. Because housing primarily has been developed in Bangladesh through the state or this capital, but also more than half is actually informal. So it's less to do with sort of like the precarities that's developed, but more to do with sort of the urban design, planning, governance of how this place came about. So as I said, this is about, that's the settlement on the left. In terms of size, it's 300,000 people in the size of 2 Buckingham Palaces, if that is helpful, or 1/10 of Central Park, depending which side of the pond you are more associated with. But But I'm really not talking about this place, right? Because the book at the end of the day is not about this place. And I never say that. It says it's an urban biography of one settlement, but it's really not about one settlement. Now, do I say that this is a grand theory of southern urbanism? I don't say that. I tell you the story of one place. If it's helpful for you to read into other places, if it's helpful to read into the informality that's happening in East London with the housing crisis, so be it. Yeah? So, but it's not a grand theorization either, but it could be describing many cities that we know. It might have a familiar feel to it. I was very lucky to get really good endorsements. I paid a lot of money for them. But the way that I looked at it is like, it's interesting because the endorsement picked up really interesting things out of the book. So, I mean, when I met Honoré Roy in 2019 when I was doing the PhD, I mean, she kept saying that, there aren't enough really stuff written in sort of like the minor cities in the global south. So there's a lot in Mumbai, there's a lot in Delhi, there's a lot in Cape Town, Johannesburg, but, large scale cities such as Dhaka, which is like 22 million people, but not enough written. So of course, that's coming through. David Satterthwaite, again, I mean, he was very blunt. I mean, he talks about, we know nothing. I mean, that's an overstatement. We know some things, but his point was, that there's so much to be known, even after being engaged with them, especially, at institutions like GDA. Again, on that note of knowing places, for those in trying to figure out where this is, so this is in Dhaka, in capital city of Bangladesh, South Asia, and then if you zoom in to the city scale, the black bits are sort of like the built places, and if you zoom in, the settlement is right in the smack in the middle of what is really formally planned neighborhoods on all sides, and you can see that. And on the east, you see that's a neighborhood called Gulshan, where the main avenue, just to give you a sense, per square foot rent right now is actually more than Fifth Avenue in New York. So that's literally like 5 minutes away from this place. If we zoom in and start to see, you can see large enclaves. Anything with the acronym that cannot be read is a government agency. They're not known for friendly acronyms. So BHTPA is this sort of telecommunications, BTCL is like, so all of this government land, they're held, and then the settlement is there. For my PhD, what did I look at? Oops, no, that's the climax. Don't give it to me. So I looked at sort of like the western part of the settlement, and that's not moving. Okay, for some reason it's not working, but there is a very dramatic increase of this into this. Yeah. So I looked into that, and then it's like, okay, who are making these decisions? How is this being planned? Because of course it is being planned. There is no magical way that this is being happening. And I'm not interested sort of like with those overly summarizing answers of this is bottom up. Surely, what's inside that bottom up if you unpack that. So the book sort of goes towards that end of unpacking the urban production in a very socio-material sense. So it's like, real things like how come the streets are different widths in different places, material things. Having the background in architecture sort of like for me was an entry point. So you can think of me as a spatial ethnographer, if that makes sense. One other point of departure is, interestingly, because talking about disciplines, when I was writing, I'm not really beholden to any particular discipline, and this is because I felt this sort of like the citational politics of belonging to a discipline, of writing in a way to belong to some discipline, often is very restrictive in the way that I write. And it was like, okay, I'm not going to privilege anyone. And that's again picked up by the endorsements. Both of them use the word kaleidoscopic. So there is this mixture of all this discipline. And this is a map of sort of like all the literature that has been baked into it. So none of that literature is in the text. but it's in the end notes. Some of it is in the end notes. But this was mapping of all the disciplines that is really informing. Yeah, this is informing the text, and it's good if you can't really pinpoint one, and it looks like a mess, because that's sort of like the basement of the book. Yeah. The next point of departure, the book says city of desire, and I say desire in a very particular way. I mobilize desire, borrowing it from Deleuze and Guattari, but then sort of like bastardizing it, and then having my own unique take on the way that they talk about desire, as in the way that Nietzsche talked about desire as sort of like a foundational urge, and a positive, a vital force in the way that things get rearranged, arranged and rearranged, made and unmade. So, and that's sort of like what something that Malik Simon picked up from there. That's sort of like, this is what should be coming through as you read the book. You can sense these different desires circulating behind the material arrangements and rearrangements. One comment that I received from the reviewers when the full book was sent was, he said, "You write in English, but you don't write in English." And I don't know if I should take it as a compliment, or is this mildly racist? I don't know how to take it, yeah? But I took it in a good spirit, because the introduction and the conclusion is, you should be able to feel that it's written in different tone. But the stories themselves are written, hopefully it shouldn't feel like written in an English tone. Because the way that I tried to do it is, there is a subliminal sort of angle to it, because that's the way that I would talk to these people there. So the book is written in English, the stories, the 11 stories, but it's written in a tone that the intonation is as if I was talking to someone there about their life. And that's important for me. It was an important part of the methodology of writing, of how to bake that in. To speak of a place in its own terms. And then the last bit is, of course, by this time, if you haven't picked it up, I am deeply in love with this place. That is not romanticizing it. Yeah? So like, I was deeply in love with, I'm deeply in love with my dad, and he is flawed. He talks about us here. So it's the same tone that, having this engagement that started in 2007, it's 18 years, I'm still working in the same settlement, it's right 5 minutes away from my house. There is a deep sense which is beyond an academic interest. There's a deeper sense of love out of which the book is coming from. So that's sort of like all the points of departures. Now if you go into the book itself, as you can see, there are 11 short stories, non-fiction narrative, however you want to say it. The biography is not chronological, so it's not like a story of how it started and where it is. It's not chronological. There is, each of the short story has a slight, and I say that, that's an important bit. It has a slight link towards a particular topic. And so another hole in the wall, the first story, might make you think about the state's complicity in the way the settlement is produced, and how the state agencies, how they function and how they are complicit. But of course it talks about everything else, but in each one there is a particular, as I said, angle that it's trying. But at the end of the day, it is that story that you see, in that. For the lecture, I will go through all 11, but hopefully this is only a teaser, a trailer. So I'll just talk about one story, yeah? And nothing can be more authentic than the story, because that's something that happened to me. Yeah, so you cannot refute my experience. I'm entitled to my experience. So that's a beautiful point to start, right? You can refute the theorization I make, but you cannot refute the sort of empirical embodied experience I had in the settlement. So each of them starts with a story. So the first one, another hole in the wall. And hopefully you can sense that there is always a link to sort of like a cultural moment, and there is subliminal. If you can pick it up, that's great. The hole in the wall. So that is 2013, the top picture. It's the same spot, 2019. The government agency, which is north of Coral, they they're like a very weak government agency. They don't have the power, sufficient power to evict these people. But they do have funds, and they're like, we don't want to see them. What can we do? They said, okay, let's build a wall, because while we go to the office, at least we don't have to see them. So they come up with this weird idea of building an entire wall along the entire length of the road that leads up to their office. And then they build this wall. And then behind this is a settlement, and as the wall is getting built by contractors, there is an informal planning going on, negotiations going on, because the people behind, they say, why don't you leave some gaps? Because we need to take, we have families there, we need to go. And then there is a negotiated puncture in the entire length by the contractors themselves, and in a way that's negotiated. And down the line, of course, that wall becomes a rubric on which the sort of like the city overflows and then used and then it goes on. Now that's an interesting way that we start thinking that the state agency, how they behaved there. But the state agencies can behave in a very punitive way. So there is this very particular story in the first where if you look at that wall, as an architect, I noticed in the first instance, and this was like when I was mapping, I asked, this wall is actually 10 inches, that is 2 bricks thick. Only for this part of that entire wall, because you can see on the right it's thinner. So I inquired, how come all of a sudden there's a thick wall right in front of that guy's shop? And the story is, there was a fire in 2012, and then for evacuation, this guy actually broke through this wall. So after all the fire is gone, and this is like people settle back, the state agency comes and then figures out someone broke through the wall, and then there's like, okay, we will build it twice as thick. So they specifically build it. Imagine for the state agency to be so punitive about, it's like going one-on-one with a slum dweller who just did something out of a necessity. He was quite, he was okay with it. He said, next time I'll just break the next segment, so not too worried about the thick wall. But this talks about, now this punitive way of engaging in the state, though this is not at the scale of 1-to-1. While I was there in 2019, this is an eviction that happened in a different part of the city. I got a call, eviction was happening. By the time I went there, 5 other families gone. And when the time that I go there, by that time, you can see how things are being piled, because things are being organized. Because all of that debris is going to be used to build somewhere that night. It had to be. Where are you going to stay? The formal parts of the city, the apartments, they're not going to let you go there because you're from the slum. So you can see by that time that there was all this, the way that they looked at it with somewhat that, okay, this is what's going to happen, then we need to, what's the best thing that we can do out of it? And that they're already sorting and organizing and scoping other areas of where they're going to go and build. So again, you see sort of like the state versus the community. But also, the second thing is the community does not exist. Why do I say that? Now, this story is about me. Before the field work, there was national election. So the vote happens in a school right next to the settlement. As I go towards, to exercise my voting rights, I'm chased away by 100 like really young men, angry, and they're not letting people go into the voting station. As I'm fleeing, running away on the rickshaw, not running, but sitting in the rickshaw comfortably, but the guy is pedaling away, he gives me an interview. I mean, he's like out of, I don't know, his fear, but he's like, I know exactly who these people are, what they're doing, and he gives me how this is organized from the settlement, how the political party pays someone to gather all these men, and they only allow people they know that they're going to vote for the party. And this is happening right in the middle of the city, right in Dhaka. Hold that thought. And down the line, after 1 month when I start my PhD, I go into the settlement, and I meet this community group together. There is someone who says, you don't need to introduce a project, I will do a research project. And he introduces my research project, using terms straight from the United Nations SDG. He talks about resilience, he talks about women empowerment, he talks about how this project, this mapping and all of that is going to really be helpful for the community, and they should help me. I was amazed because this guy, he should be speaking at the UN. And then when I got to know his name, he was the same guy who was arranging sort of like that election, rigging. But he was also the local leader. And I find out that he's also the person who is in charge of, doing all the electric supply into the household. So he's an entrepreneur, he's a community leader, he's an election rigger. And all of that is bolted into that one entity. Now, take that thought and then apply it at the scale of the community. Because there is no quintessential slum dweller, poor people coming together, forming a coalition. There is no singular entity, but all of this heterogeneity baked into the way that the settlement is organized spatially. So if you see the map, this is all the different segments and wards and the different, controlling leaders. So none of that has any spatial manifestation in terms of walls or borders, but people know exactly, like it's almost like a social, psychosocial border, that people know exactly, like, you don't go beyond that because of the next person. And this has implications in the way that settlements are upgraded. So for example, they couldn't build a road because they couldn't negotiate it with all of the local leaders. So one of the roads just went a little bit, it ended in the middle of nowhere because it said, oh no, I couldn't negotiate. So this has material manifestations in people's lives. So that chapter talks about this. The third chapter, now this interesting one, it's called the silent partner. It's because it's about NGOs. In that whole sort of imaginary between the state versus the community, or the NGOs play a very, very multifaceted role. So I'm not reducing it to one singular role. I'm just saying that there are many, many different facets to it, and that's what's explored. But I'll use, again, one story. This is a toilet that is built with your money, like those of you who pay taxes, because this is funded by the UK government through WaterAid UK, who funds a local NGO, WaterAid Bangladesh, who funds a local in that, and then who funds another local. So there's a chain of. And then that toilet is built. That toilet is built as a community asset. It's built as a community toilet. And the story is, they build the toilet, fantastic, after 2 years you go and then you start seeing that the toilet was actually meticulously placed in a location where some people had more access to that land. They started building their house around it, and because the construction is so good, they build on top of it. So it's like an engulfing, and then by the time you go in 5 years, it's someone else's house. It's like literally inside. On the report that is sent back to the UK, you built hundreds of toilets, for public good. But on the ground, how it gets manifested and how it shape shifts according to local desires is quite different. So, all of this is just one story. Look, so there are many stories like that relating to NGOs and how they're operating. But again, as I say, they're quite silent in the sense that they often assume a more apolitical stance, because they need to, always get government approval to work in Bangladesh. So there has been a sort of an apolitical stance in the way that they operate. Except for the legal ones who actually support, the slum dwellers in a court cases. They're the ones quite political. The fourth story is about events, actually. So this is called Shaped by Fire. This is there was a huge fire this is the one which is in 2016. And this is a pro bono architecture and urban farm who goes there and who says, we want to do bottom-up, people-led reconstruction and pro bono. And then they work together, workshops, it's absolutely participatory, it's co-production to the hilt. And then they produce this map with everyone's engagement, and this is the plan, right? Only the part in the black box gets built in the way. The rest of it goes back to exactly how it was before the fire. And then that talks about, even they followed sort of like the rule book of participatory processes, and then all of that. But in the end, tenure security, in the way that land was held, in the way that because those socio-political arrangements was not really reconstructed, it went straight back into the previous way that the land was held. So reconstruction, it wasn't in the end an architectural project, it wasn't an urban project itself. And even if you had followed, because everyone said, yes, we'll do it. But 6 months down the line, any uncertainty, people went back to what they knew. And what they knew was what the land that they held, the 3 rooms that I had, didn't matter if their fire separation was violated, didn't matter. So, interestingly, it went back to very, very congested, no fire safety and all of that. In this chapter, then I talk about how, in another part of the settlement, where it's not, it didn't have any fire event, there was a more spontaneous sort of recalibration at the community level that led to quite livable, widened streets. So this was a self-widening happening at another part that was not led by NGOs, that was not led by external factors, that was led by local people going around, and then I traced it, why that happened and how that happened. And for me, this was an anomaly, because the UNDP spent a lot of money for convincing people to widen roads, but all of a sudden it was very touchy. No one wants to give up even a single millimeter of their house. But then this happened in a large part of the settlement, and that's why I explained this role of events and narratives. And you have to read the book to see the argument there. Yeah, that's a hook. The social imperative. So this is where the segment changes to very mundane things such as housing and streets, land, stuff like that. But the segment starts with this idea of the social imperative. The social imperative, in this I make the argument that long before anyone builds anything, just like here you need to have a good credit history, there is an accumulation of social capital that you need for a long time before you can make stuff. The average rate in Karail for someone who is renting to become a landholder is roughly 5 years. In that 5 years, you need to accumulate that social capital through various means. It might be that, by the way, this is a picture of the local political/social club. And what's plastered around is the picture of the local councillor, the state councillor, municipal ward councillor. So it's very common for people, the local leaders, when the councillor comes to visit, to take a selfie, and then to use that selfie to go around and to tell, weave stories that are so close to him. The councillor then goes and meets a minister, does the same thing, takes a selfie, and he comes back and he says, look, I'm so close to the minister. The minister did the same thing with the fascist prime minister who is now fled to India in 2024 July, after the revolution, if you follow Bangladesh politics, whose picture is there. And so it's a chain that came all the way down. Everyone was trying to earn social legitimacy through these various performative ways. And that sort of allowed them to, build stuff that didn't matter. So, whatever the informal/the legal, that was long planned in a way where the social imperative was the most important thing. So, and people wanted to do that in many different ways. So in this chapter, I talk about the social imperative. One other instance of this is, this land is held, this is actually government land, it's disputed, which is why people have built it, and there is an injunction from the court, which is why the government can't move in and then build anything. So this nameplate that has a very formal address, roads and all of that, is absolutely not from the city corporation. It's done locally, but people who have this on their front, actually they're so much more prouder, so much more dignity, so much more pride, so much more sense of well-being, being part of it. And then this is done, this is fictitious, isn't it? This is fictitious, but pretty much this has impact in the way that people, because there is a social sort of legitimacy that's coming from this that cannot be conferred. So it's not just the material that matters. Some of the people that have houses with concrete built with bricks actually don't have that. and they're trying to get like, oh, can I be on that register, which is done locally? And so, this is where sort of like this idea of how the social and the material are sort of like entangled. So this is the story of that. Number 6 talks about the lake. So you saw how the lake was sort of reclaimed in a Dubai style sea reclamation that happened, and how did that go about? Yeah, again. So one day I'm walking, going to the settlement from my house, former part of the city. If you follow that, and then I see these people taking away this stuff, and I asked them where you're going. They said Karail. I said, and they said, this is for filling up the lake. And I said, oh wow. So I just followed them. I followed them. And then you can see pretty much this is brought down at the edge of the lake. They're dumping this. And what is this material? This is actually construction waste from the former part of the city. The former part of the city, as it's tearing down the old buildings and the new mansions and new towers are coming up, what to do with this waste? Because there is not a formal waste management of all this construction waste, people hire, this people from Karail, it's an enterprise, they get money from this side, to the formal city, to take away the rubbish, and then they sell this construction debris in Karail to build the land. And because this is construction debris, it's actually quite good, because it's, it just settles to the bottom, so they use this as a way of reclaiming the land. And I make also the argument about why not build on stilts, why not have more easier, because it's actually quite costly to fill up it's quite deep. And then there I made the argument about a social desire in Bangladesh to have quote-unquote land as opposed to more stilt-like construction that you can see in Southeast Asia. No, people want land. They're like, no, I don't care about how good the bamboo house is. I want land, like I want it. So, and then I talk about sort of like, in the cultural psyche, why this is something so important that they would spend more than the house to actually have the land first and then build. So, and then of course, there's this entanglement of the formal city and how that's coming together to build the land. It's, so that's the edge actually. The land is prepared. You can see the construction layout. So that's pretty much in development. A desire for 6 arms. Now what is 6 arms? In Bangla, 6 arms is choy hat. Choy is 6, arms is hat is arms. Everywhere I go, and there's people like doing this conversation, everyone keeps saying that all we want in the city is 6 arms. And that means all we want is a room. Like, that's all we need in the city. It's like, and then they keep saying that it's, so all government surveys done in the settlement about resettlement, about what do people need, needs assessment, there is no disagreement. Everyone wants a room which is roughly 3 meters by 3 meters, because it's coming out from their own mouth. They specifically they keep saying that we just need that one room which is roughly 3 meters by 3 meters. How does the 3 meter by 3 meter look like in Karail? You don't see the color, but those are like blue drums to store water. So you get 5 minutes of water every day, and then you store as much as you can. So water infrastructure becomes part of the interior, right? So that's like a full unit. So it's like a single room dwelling unit. You have like family of 4 maybe living there. The interesting thing is, if that's the only thing that they need, how come people end up spending a lot of money to have all these communal spaces? And how come the life is almost lived entirely in the communal spaces? But when they're reporting and they keep saying that we just need that 6 by 6, like 3 meter by 3 meter, and they never really talk about, oh, we need that additional communal space. So my argument was that there is this, this idea of the 3 meter room by, this idea is baked, and that's where I use sort of like this notion of assemblage. When they wanted, that desire is baked into an assemblage of other things that come with it. No one literally wants a 3 meter by 3 meter in a 15-story building that doesn't have all this communal functionality and entanglement. So the moment they say in a very materialist term that I want just the room, nothing more, even in that they actually mean all those entanglements coming together, because most of the housing must come with this. So people, when they're coming to rent, they check how much is shared, how many wives have to fight over that shared kitchen, and the number is 8. So if you look in Koran and you mapped it, toilets and kitchens are shared at a max of 8 families. After that, if you have 12 families, you need to have 2. So there is almost a social logic. And then because people are renting, they ask how many, my wife said, no, that's too many. And then I'm not going to rent it there. So there is a social logic in the way that housing gets arranged in a very particular set. So there's like the social upper limit of sharing, right? Through the Eye of the Needle. Through the Eye of the Needle talks about how the streets and the laneways and how mobility has actually developed here. So you might see some laneways that is as thin as that, or quite okay spacious in terms of allowing access to this. And in this chapter, it's about this story is about how I was talking with a couple, and then the man said, who lived here is like, all I need is like, I just need, if I can bring my umbrella and I can walk in, that's okay. And then the woman said, no, I need to bring the water, so it needs to be as wide as minimum that I can carry the water thing. And this was sort of like the older days. And you see quite disparate width. So in the north of the settlement, it's quite wider, and we'll get to that story of how in a space of 500 meters, there is radical differences. So that's more in the north of the settlement, where you get like much wider streets, and then the story goes on to that. One thing that was interesting is, if you know why the space shuttle that was sent to the moon was the size that it was, scientifically it would have been different. I mean, it's not the most efficient, but it's actually when the part was produced north of the Smoky Mountains in Nashville in Tennessee, they had to bring it all the way down to Houston, and there was one particular narrow tunnel. So they did an exact measurement of the tunnel size. So imagine that men's mission to moon was defined by that infrastructural hole. Very similarly, rickshaws, which is ubiquitous in Dhaka, played a very significant role in terms of the width of the settlements. In the north of the settlement, there were a lot of rickshaw garages, because the city didn't really think of rickshaw as a mode of transport. They never had any depot or garages. So where do you store them? So you need informal housing for the rickshaws. And that ended up being a large part in Coral's North, where you needed to take the rickshaw, it needed to be that width. So when these rickshaw garages were converted to housing, you end up with housing that has really spacious routes. So again, this is coincidental, but that's how the story goes. Next, this is 50 Shades of Publicness. This is about public space. And oftentimes, we talk about informal settlements. Coral is well endowed with public space in the sense that we think of public spaces as formal, large plaza or a field. So there are spaces like that. And I talk about sort of thing called institutional tagging. So if you see on the north there, how did they stop encroachment here? So when the community leaders originally left this, they had a mosque, a school, all of these institutions around it. In a way, they said, only if it's actually pegged with something that people don't want to violate, only then we might stop people from encroaching it. So this is sort of like the space was pegged with institutions, and this was done in a very, this is planning. For me, this was planned. So to say that this is, happening randomly or bottom up, I don't really understand what that means. But there are, other public spaces that I mapped, and the story talks about that. Like some have no formal intention, but some really are intentional. So there is all this mix of ways of public spaces produced. Okay, this chapter is called The Holy Cow. So if you walk into Coral, one of the first shops that you'll see as you enter from the west is a sweet shop. So this is, in Bangladeshi culture, this is really important, the sweet shop. And the story is not this. The story is what's behind. So this is all dairy based. So right behind this shop, there is a farm, like a dairy farm, which has 35 cows, right behind this. And I don't have a really glowing picture of the cow. The one that I could find is the backside of it. Sorry about that. Yeah. But then all these cows are there. Why? So the first day that I actually was visiting, my friend was there and he took me there and he's like, I'm going to show you something. He's like, okay, have this sweet. And then I had it, no idea that there's cows behind it. And he's like, okay, now let's go. And then he takes me there and then I see the cow. And then he says, do you know where it's produced? And then the factory is upstairs. So it's like the milk and the, okay. I was like, oh, that's very interesting. My supervisor in Australia, who is an Australian, I bring him there and I tell him, Kim, do you know why this is fascinating? Because these are Australian cows. The semen is imported from Victoria in Melbourne, from Melbourne, and then hybridized with local cows because of the high yield. So these, I had an Australian supervisor in a Bangladeshi settlement with a Bangladeshi student with Australian cows. So that's when I said, holy cow. So that's the story, right? But the story doesn't end there. How are they able to maintain the feed for 35 cows? Because it's a vast amount of feed. How are they getting it? They have an arrangement with the local wet bazaar. All the bits of cabbage that you don't eat, and all the bits of cauliflower that you don't eat, and all of that, wet, vegetable-y kind of like debris, is actually collected by this farm. So they clean the bazaar every day, free of cost, take all of this away, and then all that sort of like vegetable parts is actually the feed for these cows. And because this chapter is actually about this functional mix of how things, become synergistic and how they allow each other to flourish. So this chapter is about, all of this, nexus of things happening and how people change a house and then they decide, okay, I'm going to do a farm. Okay, open up the walls and then bring the cows. And then after 1 month you go and it's a farm. So there is this radical change in the way that the functional things happen, which might not look like from far, you just see the metal sheds. So it looks like, oh, just one thing. So, and the last one is the 70 Godfathers. There is a popular myth in Dhaka, which is this entire settlement is controlled by 70 mafia, like land mafia, and then they control everything. And then this is an important narrative because this is how legitimacy for eviction is produced. They keep saying, this land, it's all by 70 of this mafia. Do you want our city to be governed by, a large chunk to be, used by the mafia? And then they say, so the media narrates it. I talked with the head of our development program in BRAC. She specifically said, don't, so you're going there, but know that there are the 70 mafia. And I picked it up from her quote actually in 2019 when she says that, this idea of the 70, right? What's the story that cuts against this myth? That story starts with a fake copy of Marcel Duchamp's urinal. So I knock on a door, the door opens. This is quizzical because I'm like, did I knock on a toilet? No, I did not knock on a toilet. I know because there's a nameplate outside. I knocked on a house. I opened the door and, okay, so I was like, what's the story? The story is quite simple. This is a house cluster that has 10 rooms. 3 rooms are by renter who after 3 years bought what they were renting. And then in order to get access, to have one more access into the house, they said, this toilet we're going to convert it to a foyer connected to the street. But they said, why waste good cement on covering this up? We're not going to use it, just leave it. So that remains there as a museum piece. Yeah. So it's like you enter, and I was like, okay, if that's a story, then that's a story. What's the deeper story? The deeper story is there is all this economic exchange happening, people selling land, people selling rooms, people selling half of their rooms. All of these things are happening. So there are this, all these different tenure conditions, and this mix of tenure with various stages of rights. Some things are sold that you cannot build. Some things are sold you can build. Some things are sold you can only build up to second story. So there is all these shades of ownership used. All these patterns exist. I think I list sort of like 17 different usage rights that's already baked in, and it's all negotiated. It's all done on a formal paper, state paper, government paper, But of course, that's not legal. But you can see the level of fake formality. And I say that that actually confers a lot of legitimacy in the way that people live. Because on their day-to-day life, they know that this is legal within the context of settlement. And that matters a lot in terms of their dignity. And this is just the story just to show how tenure and land holding changes. So that's 2001. You can't even see the single room. And then 2003, this is one guy, how he sort of like held larger land. 2011, he builds, large chunk. It's like consolidated. 2012, 2013, he gets killed, and his family is not able to keep all of that land. So at one point, he had 135 rooms, and then after he's killed, his mom is not able to retain as much. And then you can see by the time that I meet his mom in 2018, they're down to 47 rooms. And this is like a flux. So now imagine this continuous flux of tenure condition. So to talk about settlement, redevelopment, to talk about all those things in static terms, by the time that you start the negotiation in 2 years' time, it's going to be different. But if we're not aware of these nuance, then of course we're going to come up with policies that don't make sense on the ground. So this was a sort of a mapping of the social set of relations there. And I start with sort of like this coral residents and tenants and landholders, because that seems to be like this myth of the slum dweller coming from the rural, but you start seeing how all these different formations, the social formations, and how they're really connected at the way top. It's like international donor agencies, and so the global flows of capital, how they find if you're buying from H&M has like a lot of the sourcing factories are right next to the settlement, large scale garments industries. Most of the people here actually work in those garments industries, and their salary is being paid because you were buying from H&M. So all these different governing relations. So that chapter talks about those things. This is the last bit. In conclusion, this might be, the 11 stories may take you to different conclusions. This was my conclusion. This is my take on it. If I could, I would have left some blank spaces so that you could write your own conclusion in the book. This is what I thought. Yeah. So this is the myth of the bottom up. I said, okay. Initially, I had 5 different ones, but it's like too much to navigate. I said, okay, there are clearly these 3 very distinct modes of organization, modes of formation that's happening, which is individualized, which I talk about as a bricolage, as collectivized, which I talk about in terms of a bazaar, and then syndicated in terms of big box, as in Walmart, big box, and then all of this have different nascent desires behind it. If you look at, so the map shows yellow is old, red is new, so as in how it grew. If you look into the oldest part of the settlement, this was actually one of the first houses built, and you can see from the map in the way that the tenure is held, this was a moment where this was not actually even built by rural migrants. This was people who couldn't pay the rent anymore in the surrounding areas, and they said, we're just going to build there. The only desire they had was this temporariness. They said, this house, I'm going to be here for 6 months. I'm going to earn enough and move back into the formal neighborhood. And that didn't happen. And then of course you see that there is this uncoordinated, they didn't care if the next house was, leaving enough gap for a future road to go in. There was all this temporariness and ad hocness in the way that they're building in the very first instances. This is a desire to survive. In the middle stages, as people started realizing that we're not moving up there anymore, we can't afford it anymore, we have to be here, there is moments of solidarity. So this was actually the moment that, Nicole, you were there. So there's a very strong sense of solidarity. By that time, NGOs had taught them about, this community-based groups, savings groups. A lot of the work was done at that time about. So there is this idea that of collective solidarity. They're learning these governance tools. And at that time, you can see. So, for example, this bit was developed where 35 of them came together and they said, okay, we're going to actually occupy that land. We're going to subdivide. We're going to build UK-style terrace housing. So, which is why you get like this slots. So this is, and then they said, okay, which is why it's roughly equally distributed. The one fat one in the middle is two brothers who later merged their plots together. And then this was more egalitarian, this was done in a way. So there is this moment where there is a collective organization happening. Since in the last 10 years, particularly, as the fascism of the government rose, there was an emergence of a very strong capitalist class in Kerala. So this is the north, where you can see the fastest way it grew was in the north. And in the north, you can see almost like a cookie cutter approach. This is apartments. This is no longer built by the people who live there. This is sort of like a mafia who said, we're going to fill up the lake, we're going to build this apartments, and we're going to sell it and then move out. So they made in total somewhat like 15 million pounds, selling all of this, and then they said, we moved out. And you can see that entire, which is why in the north you can see that it's much more wider, because there is like a massive, the scale of construction was different. So this was purely, and then you can see it's all within that 500 meters that you have all the different desires playing out. So if you were to sort of map this, and then you would see that in particular, why did it start radically from 2014 in a lot more? 2014 was the election that sort of like gave an overarching majority to the political party that got ousted last year. And then the idea was the political party to the local leaders said, if you ensure us getting elected, we'll give you a free pass. You can do whatever with this land. The police is not going to look your way. So you get a free pass. So it is clearly linked with a sort of like an authority and power at the national scale that gets, that impacting how a settlement is built, at the grain of a neighborhood, right? To end this, for me, the book ends on this notion of moving beyond, this often very dry way of talking about justice and injustice. Everyone keeps talking about it, but I mean, the way that I'm starting to see it is this a spectrum, right? A spectrum of whether things are enabling life to flourish or where things are constrained. So there are, moments where it's mild. The building a wall was mild compared to evicting, right? So that was a form of an opposition, but not eradication or entrapment. And then, there are alignments. So of course the formal city employs, so that's a good alignment. But also emancipatory actions. The lawyers who work literally going against the fascist government to keep them, to allow not evictions to happen, they have done emancipatory work. And then all this, there's a scale in which all of these things happening. So, for example, entrapment is, possibly arson, and you can see emancipatory on the other hand is, look to courts. The same, the courts had some independence, so they were allowed, they allowed that to happen. So this is like constrain and enable. At a milder scale, in between there is this, oppositions and alignments, surrounding neighborhoods producing, this livelihoods, and the wall. I already gave the example. The book ends on a particular note about, we are all talking a lot about pluriversality now. And there's this talk about to explain things on their own terms. Locally, and the last story of the book is actually a story where the new road brings in electric rickshaws. The electric rickshaws are very fast. One kid gets injured. The mom works in the garment, the parents work in the garment factory. The entire street, some people started taking money from each of the shops, gathered the money, took the kid to the hospital, brought back home, bought a toy, left him in the. All of that was done by the local neighborhood. It's not done by local leaders, or it's not done by a formal institution. None of that. For me, this is emblematic of how, despite all this resistance, despite all the state's resistance, despite all the uncertainty, how these forms of everyday care, everyday enabling, everyday love allows people to actually build a settlement. For me, then it's not a question of a binary between justice and injustice, because there was no transaction involved. It wasn't about way that there was no obligation. So a lot of these things happen where there is no obligation, but people end up actually caring for each other in a way that comes with grace. The reason that I use this concept of ihsan is in Arabic, but in Bangladesh it's changed into ahsan, and people talk about like, just do ahsan to me, just help me out here, show grace, love, mercy, joy. They don't use it in the way that I'm talking about at the scale of settlement, but for me, ihsan allows a way of moving in a justice which is empathetic, which is not just about the legal, which is not just about rights, which is not just about, that's a lower minimum. That's like a bar, like a lower bar. So in the book, the end, I sort of like start exploring this concept, this notion of a more than just framework. And then of course this is about answering a call to pluriversal thinking, words and words that don't make sense in an Anglophone discourse, to bring them in and to see if there are other ways of knowing and worlding that we can do. So that's where the book sort of ends. Right now I'm working with Vanessa Kasanproto on a book where I'm expanding this, hopefully this idea of ihsan in relation to climate justice. So we're writing a paper called Climate Ihsan, and then that's what it's going right now. So there's very much, for the conclusion of the book is sort of like, for me, a starting point for a different journey. So this is where I can end. I don't see the book is being finished. That's because I'm still working there, and then this is ongoing. Just like this person who came. This is a B&Q in Karail. So this person came to buy 2 bricks. Literally, it's like I just need 2 bricks. It's like at that point, and then I thought it was beautiful because it's like he's going to fix his house. He just needs 2 bricks, and then he comes in and then buys 2 bricks and lives. So again, the Bloomsbury collection is an open access book. I did have one slide in particular for ECRs, if it's okay in terms of time. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah. So it's an open access. That's an important bit of the project. Yeah. The book is open access, thankfully, because I got a grant from Sheffield, but also it's CC BY in a way that Bloomsbury do not have rights. If you were to take this in Bangladesh and photocopy it and sell it, they can't hold you to it. And I thought it's important because growing up, we didn't get access to, because this is expensive stuff. So we had to buy like cheap copies, which was illegal. So, this is, you can copy it and it's still legal. So. Just a note to ECRs or PhD students or whoever think of a book project. This is like 5 things that I thought was very important for me. I don't know if this applies. The best time to start the process was 1 year ago, and the second best time is now. It took like 2 years to get through. Even when I had a manuscript that was at 70%, and then it took 2 years of the whole process. So of course it is arduous process. Learning to let go, rewriting for the context. Yes, I think this is an important bit because by that time, it's 2 years it's gone, and then the context would have changed. So of course, cutting down bits, this is important because, and then for me, this is an important bit. The book is more than the sum of the chapters. Which is what that makes it the book, and not a collection of chapters. So that's for what is that for everyone? That's I don't know. And reading sample book proposals before writing yours, I think this was very important because, the publishers have a very particular way of talking about the book, and you need to master that. Even if you want to smuggle some ideas in, you need to sort of put yours in one discipline, and then they need to talk. So, undisciplining is not cool with publishers. Yeah, they want to figure it out, like in which discipline you belong. So you need to fake that. And this is the last slide. I'll leave it on that. I said that I'll end with farmers. Yeah, this is for you. Yeah, farmers. Yeah, this is the project that I'm right now doing. So I wrote. There's a new journal article came last month. It's called Dirty Research, which is about talking about the methodology that I employ here, which is about that. The moment I started the PhD, they said you are the 45th PhD student from Karail, and the 45th one to leave this place. They said no one comes back. They come, they do the data, they take the data, they take photographs, and then they go away. No one comes back. I made a very silly promise. I said I will come back. which is why I'm stuck with Caribbean. Yeah. So we have been working with colleagues there. So we are working with an urban farming collective called Najjyo Abashon. We have been trying different grant applications in the last 5 years. Not successful. Last year we got a grant, £500,000 from UK Foreign Office, which is administered through IAD. It's part of the REDA, the Reversing Environmental Degradation. So the lake that you saw is actually quite polluted. We're working with this urban collective, the farmers, to do vegetation in a way in the lake edge to bring back the biodiversity, and sort of like being funded by climate finance. So there's a lot of that. If you are interested, you can go to the website and check that out. This is an ongoing project until 2027 of December 2027. So 3.5-year project. It's ongoing, and you can get updated there. But as I said, I'm writing an unfinished book. I don't know what stories are coming, but that's where we are at right now. And I'll stop there.